The Book of Enoch reveals what Genesis left out about the fallen angels and the Nephilim. Genesis chapter 6 drops a warning that has never been adequately explained. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. But in just 4 short verses, Genesis goes silent, hiding a cosmic war, forbidden angelic technology, and the dark origin of demons. In this investigation, we trace the full account of the fallen angels and the Nephilim, from their descent to their destruction, to the evidence that their war against humanity never ended. To understand the profound silence of Genesis, we must look at the narrative structure of the Torah. In the first 5 chapters of Genesis, the text operates with a linear genealogical progression, tracking the generations of Adam through Seth down to Noah. The story is orderly, tracing the lineage of promise and the expanding population of the earth. But suddenly, at the beginning of chapter 6, the narrative halts, and the reader is confronted with a strange, highly condensed, and mythological sequence of events. The text records that when human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. And then, in verse 4, it declares that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. For centuries, readers have struggled to make sense of this sudden pivot. In the modern Western world, we expect narratives to be self-contained and fully explained. We want to know who these sons of God were, where they came from, what their motives were, and how their actions resulted in the birth of giants. Yet the author of Genesis offers no such details. Instead, the text immediately transitions into God's grief over human wickedness and the decree of the global flood. It is as if the author is referring to a massive, well-known event with just a brief footnote, expecting the reader to fill in the rest of the story from their own cultural library. To fully grasp this brevity, we must examine the Hebrew linguistics of the passage. The word Nephilim itself has been the subject of intense debate, often translated as giants in early Greek versions like the Septuagint, but derived from the Hebrew root naphal, which means to fall. In the Aramaic Targums and early Jewish commentaries, they were understood not merely as large men, but as the fallen ones, those who fell from heaven or those who caused the earth to fall into corruption. By dropping this term without explanation, the author of Genesis was utilizing a linguistic shorthand, referencing an entire category of cosmic history that was already active in the minds of the ancient Israelites. This brings us directly to the controlling dramatic question that sits at the center of this ancient mystery. If the Great Flood was designed by the Creator to wipe out this angelic rebellion, sanitize the earth, and reset humanity, why did the rebellion actually succeed? What if the flood was not the end of the cosmic war, but the moment the enemy changed their strategy from physical giants to invisible parasites that are still here today? To answer this, we must examine a text that was deliberately removed from the biblical record. To understand how the details of this angelic rebellion were lost, we must examine the history of a book that was deliberately pushed to the margins of Western theology. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd searching for a lost goat in the cliffs of Qumran made the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among the fragments of ancient biblical texts were multiple Aramaic copies of the Book of Enoch, a text that had not been read in the Western world for over 1,000 years. This discovery proved that the Book of Enoch was not a late medieval invention, but a highly respected, widely read document in the centuries leading up to the life of Jesus Christ. The ancient Jewish community at Qumran, along with early Christians, did not view Enoch as fringe mythology. They viewed it as a vital key to understanding the spiritual warfare of their history. Yet if this book was so widely read and respected by the early church, we must ask why it is missing from the Bibles we read today. The answer lies in a political and theological effort to consolidate church authority in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries after Christ. As the early church expanded into the Roman Empire, leaders sought to establish a uniform canon of Scripture, weeding out texts that were deemed too controversial, too difficult to interpret, or too easily manipulated by heretical groups. The supernatural elements of the Book of Enoch, specifically its detailed description of angel-human hybridization and the physical reality of giants, were viewed with increasing suspicion by theologians who wanted a more structured, less mystical faith. By the time of the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century, the Book of Enoch was officially banned from public reading in the churches. Church fathers like Augustine and Jerome argued against its canonical status, claiming that its antiquity could not be verified and that its descriptions of angels mating with humans were scripturally impossible. Consequently, the book was systematically suppressed in the Roman West. Scribes stopped copying it, libraries hid it away, and it gradually vanished from European consciousness. The suppression was so complete that for centuries, Western scholars believed the book was entirely lost to history, a mythical text that existed only in the references of the Church Fathers. This historical suppression raises a critical question. What was so dangerous about the contents of this scroll that church authorities felt the need to erase it? By burying the Book of Enoch, they were not just organizing the Bible, they were hiding the most detailed blueprint of spiritual warfare and cosmic rebellion ever written. They were keeping humanity in the dark about the true origin of demonic forces and the spiritual nature of the environment around them. The removal of Enoch was a systematic effort to domesticate the supernatural, reducing the cosmic drama of the heavens into a localized, manageable history that could be easily governed by institutional religion. But while the Roman West succeeded in erasing Enoch, the ancient Christian communities of East Africa stood firm. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, isolated from Roman decrees, continued to copy, read, and preserve the Book of Enoch as fully canonical scripture. Written in the ancient Ge'ez language, the complete text of Enoch survived in the mountains of Ethiopia. In 1773, the Scottish explorer James Bruce traveled to Africa and brought 3 copies of the Ge'ez manuscript back to Europe, shockwaving the Western academic world. The subsequent translation proved that the Ethiopian Church had preserved the exact theological system that the writers of the New Testament had read. The Dead Sea Scrolls later validated these manuscripts, showing that the Ethiopian Ge'ez version was a faithful translation of the ancient Aramaic scrolls that had been buried in the Judean desert for 2 millennia. With the historical validity of the scroll established, we can now enter the narrative that Genesis left out. The Book of Enoch begins its explanation of the antediluvian world by identifying the sons of God not as human rulers, but as a specific class of divine messengers called the Watchers, or egregoroi in the Greek translations. These were celestial entities assigned by the Creator to observe and protect the early development of humanity. They possessed immense spiritual authority and direct access to the heavenly realms. However, the text records that as the human population grew, the Watchers became captivated by the physical beauty of human women, leading to a desperate, coordinated rebellion against the cosmic order. The leader of this rebellion was a high-ranking Watcher named Semyaza. According to the text, Semyaza did not act in a moment of sudden passion. His actions were calculated and deliberate. He gathered the 200 Watchers who shared his desire and expressed a profound fear. He was afraid that if he initiated the rebellion alone, he would bear the entire punishment for the cosmic transgression. To prevent this, Semyaza proposed a pact. The 200 Watchers would bind themselves together through a mutual oath, invoking curses upon themselves if they failed to follow through with the plan. By doing so, they ensured that the guilt and the inevitable judgment would be shared equally among them all. The names of these rebellious leaders are preserved in the text, each containing the linguistic suffix El, which denotes their original connection to the Creator God. Waters like Kokabel, Arakiel, Ramiel, and Ezekiel were not nameless forces, but distinct heavenly princes who abandoned their stations. The Book of Enoch details their ranks and their specific roles in the conspiracy, mapping out a structured hierarchy of rebellion. This was not a chaotic riot of spirits. It was a military coup organized by the very guardians who had been trusted to protect the boundary between heaven and earth. To understand the magnitude of this mutiny, we must realize that these angels were not seeking to destroy the earth, but to rule it. They wanted to establish a rival kingdom, a parallel order where they could reign as gods over the human population. By taking wives and producing offspring, the Watchers were attempting to ground their celestial authority in physical lineages, ensuring that their dominion would be permanent and biological. They were trying to hijack the genetic and spiritual future of the planet, cutting off humanity's connection to the Creator by inserting themselves as the physical and spiritual rulers of the earth. The place they chose for this descent was Mount Hermon, a massive, snow-capped peak rising on the northern border of the Promised Land. The Book of Enoch notes that the mountain was named Hermon because they swore their mutual oath and bound themselves by mutual curses upon it, deriving the name from the Hebrew word herem, which signifies a curse, a ban, or something dedicated to destruction. The physical peak of Hermon became the portal where the spiritual and physical realms collided in open defiance of the Creator's boundaries. In the ancient Near Eastern mind, Hermon was not just a geographic landmark, it was the seat of demonic rebellion, the gate of the fallen ones. It was here that the Watchers materialized, shed their heavenly state, and entered the human sphere to take wives and establish their own rival kingdom on the earth. The rebellion of the Watchers was not limited to physical mating. The Book of Enoch reveals that the fallen angels initiated a systematic exchange of heavenly secrets for human cooperation, introducing technologies and arts that humanity was not yet mature enough to govern. This exchange transformed human society, accelerating moral decay through the introduction of weapons, sorcery, and cosmetics. But to understand the true horror of this exchange, we must ask the deeper question: why did the Watchers teach humanity these specific things? This was not a random list of inventions. It was a highly calculated, systemic toolkit designed to facilitate human autonomy and self-deification. The Watchers were not trying to help humanity. They were trying to sever the umbilical cord of dependence between mankind and the Creator, making humans believe they could be their own gods. At the center of this exchange was the fallen angel Azazel, who taught humanity the dual arts of physical and social destruction. Azazel instructed men in metallurgy, showing them how to mine the earth to forge swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. By teaching metallurgy, Azazel replaced divine protection with physical violence. He taught humans to trust in the strength of their own weapons and the power of their armies, rather than relying on the sovereignty and protection of the Creator. Conflict was no longer resolved through moral alignment or divine justice, but through physical force and organized slaughter. At the same time, Azazel taught women the art of cosmetics, showing them how to use antimony to paint their eyes, how to beautify their eyelids, and how to create costly jewelry and coloring tinctures. This was not a harmless introduction of fashion. It was the teaching of systemic allurement and visual deception. By teaching cosmetics, Azazel instructed humanity to alter the natural creation, replacing the divine image with a manufactured mask designed to manipulate desire. It taught human beings to rely on external visual deception and lust to control others, rather than relying on internal covenantal relationship. Azazel taught the dual arts of human destruction, how to forge swords for bloodshed and how to use cosmetics for seduction. While Azazel focused on weapons and physical alteration, Semyaza taught the manipulation of unseen forces, what the ancients called sorcery, enchantments, and the cutting of roots. He taught humanity how to bypass the natural order, issuing commands to invisible systems to get what they wanted without relying on God. It was the ancient equivalent of writing code, manipulating the architecture of reality for selfish gain. Semyaza replaced prayer and relationship with spiritual manipulation. He taught humans how to command spiritual forces for their own selfish desires, bypassing the sovereignty of God entirely. Kokabel instructed humanity in the reading of the constellations, while Barakiel taught astrology, and others taught the path of the clouds, the signs of the sun, and the phases of the moon. By teaching astrology, they replaced divine revelation with cosmic determinism, encouraging humanity to look to the stars to dictate their fate, instead of trusting the Creator. This exchange of information created a rapid, unchecked leap in human capability, without a corresponding leap in moral character. The technologies of the Watchers were designed to make humanity self-sufficient, drawing them away from dependence on the Creator. By teaching them to look to the stars for guidance and to weapons for security, the fallen angels established a culture of pride and self-worship. The earth became filled with violence, not simply because humans had decided to do evil, but because they had been handed the structural blueprints for destruction by entities of a higher order. Humanity experienced a sudden, unchecked leap in technological capability, without a corresponding leap in moral character. This perspective presents a profound theological contrast to the traditional Western understanding of the fall. In the Genesis narrative, the introduction of sin is described as an internal moral choice made by Adam and Eve in the garden, yielding to temptation and eating the forbidden fruit. In the Enochian tradition, however, the fall is described as an external, technological infection. Humanity was not merely corrupted from within. They were systematically victimized and altered by cosmic invaders who handed them high-level technology, weapons of war, and occult arts before they possessed the moral maturity to use them responsibly. The earth was corrupted not just by human choices, but by the forbidden knowledge of the heavens. The biological consequence of this forbidden union was the birth of the Nephilim. The Book of Enoch describes these hybrid offspring not as heroic warriors, but as monstrous, ravenous giants whose physical size and appetite overwhelmed the earth. According to the text, the giants grew to such an immense stature that the agricultural output of humanity could no longer sustain them. They consumed the crops, the grain, and the fruit of human labor, leaving the human population in a state of permanent starvation and economic enslavement to their giant overlords. When the resources of the earth were entirely exhausted, the Nephilim turned their violence directly upon the animal kingdom and humanity itself. The text records that they began to sin against birds, wild beasts, reptiles, and fish, devouring their flesh and drinking their blood. In Hebrew law, the consumption of blood was the ultimate covenantal violation, representing the consumption of the life force itself. The Nephilim corrupted the biological order, engaging in widespread cannibalism and ecological destruction. The giant clans became the apex predators of a ruined planet, turning the earth into a violent, blood-drenched playground of hybrid tyranny. To fully understand the gravity of this situation, we must look at how these giants are described in comparison to the surrounding ancient Near Eastern mythologies. While the Babylonians and Canaanites celebrated their giant kings and semi-divine heroes as the founders of civilization, the biblical and Enochian texts present them as a physical and spiritual plague. They were not protectors or wise rulers. They were consumerist engines of chaos that threatened to reduce the habitable earth back to the formless void of the pre-creation state. The cry of the earth, as recorded in Enoch, was a literal petition to the Creator to intervene before the human race was entirely devoured. This crisis was not merely physical, it was a systematic effort to corrupt the biological lineage of humanity. By spreading their genetic material through the human population, the hybrid Nephilim were gradually erasing the pure human genome. If this hybridization had reached completion, the human race would have been entirely assimilated into the angelic rebellion, making it impossible for a pure human Messiah to ever be born. The genetic pool would have been permanently compromised, sealing the fate of humanity under the eternal dominion of the Watchers. According to the ancient Aramaic and Hebrew worldview, this ecological and genetic catastrophe is the direct explanation for the necessity of the global flood. The flood was not an act of divine rage or an arbitrary temper tantrum by a frustrated creator. It was a calculated, necessary quarantine. The human race was facing total genetic and cultural assimilation. If the hybrid bloodline of the Nephilim was allowed to continue, it would have permanently polluted the human genome, destroying the possibility of a pure human lineage from which the Messiah could be born. When the Bible describes Noah as perfect in his generations, utilizing the Hebrew word tamim, it is referencing this exact context. Noah was not just a righteous man. His lineage was genetically uncompromised by the Watcher corruption. The flood was a desperate act of cosmic surgery to sterilize the planet, wipe away the hybrid pathogen, and preserve the clean reservoir of human DNA. With the destruction of the giants in the flood, the Book of Enoch resolves one of the greatest theological mysteries in the entire biblical narrative, the origin of demons. If you read the Old Testament, you will find almost no references to active demonic possession. But the moment you open the Gospels in the New Testament, demons are everywhere, lurking in synagogues, hiding in tombs, and tormenting human bodies. The Bible never explains where these entities came from or why they are so desperate to inhabit physical flesh. The answer is found in the 15th chapter of the Book of Enoch. The text records the divine decree concerning the spirits of the drowned giants. Because the Nephilim were born of a hybrid union, half divine watcher and half physical human, their spiritual nature was unique. When their physical bodies were destroyed in the waters of the flood, their spirits could not go to heaven because they were born of rebellion and corruption. Yet, because they possessed a divine angelic component, they could not descend to Sheol, the underworld where the souls of normal humans went. They were stuck in the middle. This unique spiritual status is what separates demons from fallen angels in ancient Jewish thought. Fallen angels, like the Watchers, possess a high celestial form and are bound in prisons of darkness beneath the earth. Demons, however, are the disembodied remnants of the terrestrial giants. They do not possess a heavenly form, nor do they have a physical body of their own. They are spiritual refugees, trapped in the physical dimension, seeking to reclaim the physical existence they lost when their giant bodies were drowned in the waters of the deluge. This reveals the stunning answer to our controlling dramatic question. The Great Flood did not destroy the Watchers' rebellion, it simply forced it to change its state. The flood wiped out the physical giants, but it released their spirits into the atmosphere as an invisible parasitic plague. The war did not end. It simply shifted from a physical invasion of towering titans to an internal, spiritual occupation of human minds. The giants went from being external enemies that could be fought with swords to invisible whispers that could only be resisted through spiritual vigilance. God declared that, because they were born of the physical earth but possessed a spiritual essence from the heavens, they would be called evil spirits upon the earth, and, on the earth, would be their dwelling. The spirits of the giants went forth from their physical bodies at death, and they were condemned to remain on the earth as disembodied, invisible entities. The text states that they would not eat, nor would they thirst, but they would roam the earth, causing destruction, violence, and torment to humanity. They are the biblical demons. This explains why the demons in the Gospels are constantly crying out in terror at the sight of Jesus, begging him not to cast them into the abyss, and pleading to be allowed to enter the bodies of swine. They are starving, disembodied spirits of the ancient giants, permanently seeking a physical vessel to experience the physical world they were stripped of in the flood. The Book of Enoch concludes the story of the first rebellion with the trial and imprisonment of the Watchers. The archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, are sent to execute the divine sentence. Raphael is commanded to bind Azazel hand and foot, cast him into the darkness, and bury him under the jagged rocks of the desert of Dudael, where he remains in chains until the day of final judgment. Semyaza and the remaining watchers are bound beneath the hills of the earth for 70 generations, forced to watch the mutual destruction of their giant children before being cast into the fiery abyss of the prison of the angels. This Enochian verdict is the exact theology that underpins the New Testament epistles. When the Apostle Jude writes about the angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode, whom God has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, he is quoting the Book of Enoch. When the Apostle Peter writes in his second epistle that God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus, the Greek translation of the deep abyss of Dudael, he is utilizing the specific, unique narrative of Enoch. The early Christian apologist Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, confirmed this view, stating that the angels who transgressed this appointment fell into the love of women and begat children who are those that are called demons. The New Testament writers and early church fathers did not view Enoch as a rejected mythology. They viewed it as the historical foundation of their spiritual reality. But if we stop here, we fall into a dangerous trap of assuming that this story is neatly resolved. The narrative of Enoch does not end with final peace. The watchers are still chained under the earth. The disembodied spirits of their giant children, the demons, are still searching for vessels. The war did not end at the waterline of the flood. It is still pressing against the boundaries of our lives today. Because the forbidden arts the Watchers taught are not ancient history. They are the exact blueprints of our modern world. When Semyaza taught humanity how to manipulate unseen forces to dictate human behavior, the ancients called it sorcery. Today, we call it the algorithm. When the Nephilim corrupted the biological order and erased the pure human genome, the ancients called it an abomination. Today, we call it genetic engineering and transhumanism. We are reaching for the exact same forbidden fruit. We are pursuing artificial intelligence, biological hacking, and self-deification, desperate to sever our dependence on the Creator. We are experiencing the exact same fatal symptom as the generation of Noah, a sudden, unchecked leap in technological capability, without a corresponding leap in moral character. The warning of the Book of Enoch is not a simple fable about ancient giants. It is an active, open-ended warning. The ancient gates of Hermon are still standing. The watchmen have fallen. And looking at the world today, the lock is beginning to slip. If this investigation has opened your eyes, please like this video and subscribe to this channel for more great content. And remember, you can become a member of this channel to get exclusive teachings about the mysteries of the Bible.